So thank you, Vice-Chancellor, for that wonderful introduction. Welcome to all of you. Thank you for coming tonight. Hopefully there's a little of something for everyone. So we'll see if we can please you all. So before I get started, I think with anyone who's spent time in any career, you owe a lot of thanks to a lot of people. I owe an awful lot to mentors and colleagues who over the years have inspired and helped and assisted and sometimes argued with me. I won't read out all the names, but here you are. I also owe a huge debt of gratitude to my research group. I've been fortunate to work with some very talented students who all now occupy very prestigious positions. And for tonight in particular, I'd like to acknowledge Matt Jones, who helped me with the media content for this. And finally, not related to science, but I'd like to thank my family because scientists are notoriously strange individuals, and we often suck up our weekends and our evenings working when we should be attending to our families too. So to my lovely wife and son, thank you for that. So hey, today's talk, really I had in mind when I was given the chance to give this address to talk about life in the broadest possible context. So I'm going to try to do that. And I'm going to try to do it by asking 3 questions. And those 3 questions are, where do we come from? Are we alone? And where are we going? So hopefully that will form the framework for some hopefully scientific but also light-hearted look at life itself. So when I talk about life, I'm not talking simply about the diversity of humanity. In fact, this slide looks remarkably like the view I've got looking here in the room. So it's a testament to AUT's diversity that we probably do better than that slide. And I'm not talking about diversity in the sense of all animals, plants, and microbes that live on the Earth. I want to take a much bigger picture view of this. I want to take what we call a macro view of life. And by considering life in the broadest possible way, we really are delving into a relatively new topic called astrobiology. And that is essentially the biology of life in the universe. And that's really the thread for today's presentation. So first of all, before we get started in considering those 3 questions, I think what we have to do is define life. What is life? So I think we would all agree that this is life. It's a tree, it's full of green stuff, it grows, that's life. And I think we probably also agree that this is life, rather it's fish. We'd also agree that this is life. It's a mushroom, it's a fungus, it's not that cute, but it's still life. This is very cute, and this is definitely life, the one on the right, of course. And even to people like me, who are microbiologists by training, little creatures we see under microscopes are also life. So one of the problems we have is forming a definition for life because it is so diverse. So what we need to do is define life. So one could ask the question, is that alive? Because if we take the viewpoint of some extremely clever individuals, in this case Carl Sagan, who was one of the greatest cosmologists, in my view, ever, he suggested that life could be defined physiologically. That is, a living thing eats and breathes and moves and eats, but cars do that. So of course this is not an adequate definition for life. One could also say, well, hey, let's define life metabolically. That is, living organisms produce energy from their environments. But of course, this also is not sufficient because grains, seeds, spores are all dormant and essentially not really living. You look at a dried piece of corn, it's not really living and doing anything. And conversely, fire, some people could claim, was alive because it's consuming and producing energy. We also have a genetic definition for life, and as a geneticist, I would say, yes, we must be close. We must be almost here. So living organisms would reproduce and pass on their hereditary information. But actually, again, this is not sufficient. So consider, for example, mules. Mules are hybrids. That is, they're a cross between 2 species. And hybrids generally are sterile, regardless of which 2 species you cross with. So although this mule is alive, it doesn't fit that genetic definition of life. So is there one universal definition of life that we could use today? Well, there is. So you'll be very pleased to learn that all of you are autonomous systems with open-ended evolutionary capacities. That's what you all are. They sound like robots, I know, but, but that's the definition with greatest clarity to define what you are. And it's really based upon 4 tenets. Firstly, that all life forms are packaged into a membrane-enclosed cell, essentially a bag that holds all of your bits and ingredients that you need to stay alive together. Secondly, that those cells will grow, reproduce, and adapt to their environment in response to environmental cues. Thirdly, that there are records within that cell that allow it to record and move on from adaptive changes. And finally, that there are catalysts within that cell that allow function, the physiology that we talked about in the original Carl Sagan definition. So this is really the definition of life that I feel is most appropriate. Now, when we talk about life, we can really boil everything down to just 2 types of cell. This one, my favorite as a microbiologist, is the prokaryotic cell. It's the simplest unit of life one can imagine, really. It's a single bag or membrane that encloses DNA and proteins that do the work of the cell and record adaptive changes. On the right here is a picture of E. coli. You've probably all heard of that organism. It lives in our guts and can occasionally cause problems. That's a bacterium just like this. The only other type of cell that there is the eukaryotic cell. And this is rather more complex. As you can see, I won't go through what all these things are and what they do, but you can see that the architecture of this cell is fundamentally more complex. And the eukaryotic cell can form other single-celled creatures. So, for example, the amoeba, which we're all probably familiar with from high school, or even more complex creatures like squirrels or even you and I. So all life can be boiled down to those 2 types of building block, the prokaryotic cell and the eukaryotic cell. So where do we, and by we I mean those 2 types of cells which form all living things on Earth, where do we come from? That's the first of those 3 questions I want to ask. So let's try to provide some answers to that now. So as far as we know, we're the only living things in our solar system and probably further afield. So looking at our planet Earth, we know that life is fairly abundant, but we haven't found life anywhere else as yet. So what makes Earth such a great place to live? Why is it that life is here but not elsewhere? Well, to explain that, I need to introduce a concept to you. And that concept is the habitable zone. And it's really quite simple, but the diagram here best explains it. So this here is our sun, and these lines represent the radius, the elliptical orbits of planets going further away from the sun. Those that are close to the sun in the red area are too close to be cool enough to support life. Those that are further afield are too cold to support life. But planets in this green zone are at just the right temperature, which is why it's often called the Goldilocks zone. It's not too hot, not too cold, to support life. Now, it's a bit more complex than that because planets also need to be the right mass to retain an atmosphere. So, the key to understanding why life exists in our solar system is this. Number 1, the planet needs to be at the right distance from its sun, its star, to support liquid water, since liquid water is necessary for all life. Life simply cannot exist without water. And secondly, the planet must be of the correct size to retain an atmosphere. And to retain an atmosphere that has the gases we need for life, things like carbon dioxide, like oxygen, but not retaining toxic and noxious gases such as methane, ammonia, and so forth, like the larger planets would do. Okay. Right, there was obviously a pause for effect there. So look, we've introduced the concept of the habitable zone. That's where all life exists, those 2 types of cells in those planets that are just the right place. But here's the thing. That habitable zone is not constant over time. Earth has not always been the best place for life. and indeed in the future, it will not remain the best place for life. And that's because stars like our sun are born, they're mature, and then they die. They have a lifespan just as we do. And so in order to understand the concept of life and where we come from, we actually need to look at the evolution of a solar system before we can understand the evolution of life. So let's take a look at the history of our solar system and just illustrate that point. So let's ask a question. Where did everything come from? Well, you've probably heard of this notion of the Big Bang. The Big Bang is the event that is thought to have formed the known universe about 15 billion years ago. And it's the point in space and time where everything came to be. And cosmologists assume that there was nothing before the Big Bang and nothing outside that universe. Now, of course, this brings up rather instantly a thought that science doesn't always have all the answers. And this is one of the many reasons why I think that faith and science are entirely congruent with each other. And some of the clashes that occur are perhaps needless in respect to faith and science, but more on that later. So perhaps to illustrate how I feel about that, there's a wonderful analogy which I came across years ago about the boiling kettle. If you ask a scientist, why is this kettle of water boiling? He might retort, well, because the heat is exciting the water molecules, and then once they reach the vapor pressure of the surrounding air, it's boiling. That's a correct answer. But there's another correct answer. Perhaps if you ask someone else, they might say, well, look, the kettle's boiling because I'm thirsty and I want a cup of tea. These are entirely valid viewpoints to have on the same item. So, our solar system. Essentially, the solar system was born about 15 billion years ago, and in a relatively short space of time, the building blocks of atoms were formed. Atoms themselves were formed, at first very simple ones like hydrogen and helium. And eventually, over time, over about 1 billion years, these atoms clumped together to form cosmic dust, which clumped into galaxies. And then eventually, after about 10 billion years, our own solar system was formed. And this is what our solar system would look like if you were able to peer in from outside. So you have at its center the star, which is our sun. And then you have the warm planets. You've got Mercury, Venus, Earth, and our moon. Then Mars, the asteroid belt. Then you've got Jupiter, Saturn, and then the outer planets. So this is a solar system. We know from our habitable zone notion that that green Goldilocks zone of life must occur about here. And that indeed is where we know life exists on our planet. So we've got a planet Earth. We know the solar system is formed. But when the planet Earth was formed, there was stuff flying everywhere. So at what point did it become truly habitable in the sense that life could sustain itself? Well, if we look at this graph, on the bottom, on the bottom axis is time, 4.5 billion years ago, all the way up to the present. And on the vertical axis here is the number of asteroid impacts. You can see when Earth was very young, the number of impacts was very large, and it reduced and reduced and reduced. There was something quite catastrophic that happened here called the lunar cataclysm, where another young planet called Theia clashed with Earth and essentially melded into the Earth, and bits fell off, and those bits became our moon. But after that, very soon after that, we see evidence of the earliest life on Earth. And as you can see, the number of asteroid impacts declined exponentially after that. So we have not only to have the right planet in the right place, but also to have a whole series of events lining up to allow life itself to exist. And I like to call these a series of fortuitous events. So first of all, we look at the very origin of our sun. Our sun is a young star. That is, it was formed relatively recently. And because of that, it's made of things other than just simple elements, not just hydrogen and helium. You and I are not made of hydrogen and helium. We're made of carbon, of oxygen, of nitrogen, sulfur, phosphorus. And these elements are only formed in stars as they evolve and get older. And so old stars don't have these chemicals, and so they can't possibly support life in the planets around them. Our sun can. Secondly, our planet is in that habitable zone. It's in the right place where water can exist as a liquid and where there is an atmosphere that keeps just the right gases to allow life. Thirdly, this lunar cataclysm that I've mentioned to you may have been essential. There's a picture of an animation of what it was probably like here. That's our moon forming after that impact. Because imagine an Olympic hammer thrower as they whirl around to throw their hammer on the end of a rope. They actually don't fall out of the circle that they're running around in, because that weight at the end of their hammer rope keeps them stable. It's the same notion for Earth. Earth has a moon which gives it rotational stability, and that's been important to us. Also, we have a magnetic core. So here, this little diagram here shows Earth, and these blue lines show you our magnetic field, which protect us from the mass of radiation which exudes from our sun and also incoming cosmic rays. We also have just the right level of impacts, because although I showed you that we've had an awful lot of asteroid impacts, and some of them, like that lunar cataclysm, were catastrophic, a large volume of low-level asteroid impacts were necessary for two reasons. Number one, they seeded the Earth with water, and number two, organic chemicals. These are the building blocks of life. So without these, we would never have had life. So those asteroid impacts were actually essential. And the reason we didn't get lots of large asteroids impacting us is due to the Jupiter effect. We have a very large planet slightly further out in our solar system that essentially sucks in those large asteroids by virtue of its gravity. And so it protects our Earth and is often referred to as a good planet for that reason. The other fortuitous thing that we have, although we might not all agree living down in this part of the world, is tectonics and volcanism. Because without these activities on the planet Earth, there would be no recycling of carbon. Volcanoes spew out carbon into the atmosphere. It's then fixed in the oceans and is recycled via plate tectonics. You have to have this recycling in order to allow life to exist. Otherwise, all the carbon gets stuck in the planet and is not available to build creatures. So, with those 6 fortuitous events all lining up together to make our planet habitable, we had life evolve. Now, the first chemical signatures for life were about 3.85 billion years old. That's an enormous, enormous time frame to consider. These are chemical isotopes found in rocks in Greenland. And the first fossils were found about 3.5 billion years old. So here I can show you a picture of one of these. This was from a rock in Australia. This is a fossil of a Cyanobacterium, a very primitive photosynthetic microbe. So like a very, very, very primitive plant. And here is a picture of a Cyanobacterium that's alive today. They're remarkably similar. And in fact, they've changed very little over billions of years. For a long time, it was regarded that this was the first form of life on Earth. However, the advent of genetics changed that view radically. And genetic evidence tells us that actually the earliest form of life on Earth was probably this little orange here. It's not an orange, it's actually a small single-celled organism called Methanopyrus. And these creatures live at the bottom of the oceans in these hydrothermal vents. And they have a very simple metabolism. They can create energy out of things you and I could never eat, like iron and sulfur. And they're able to tolerate the noxious conditions that would undoubtedly have existed on early Earth. So this is our earliest ancestor that you're looking at right now. Very soon after the origin of life, life expanded to cover the planet. And from about 3.5 to 1 billion years ago, we got aggregates of those cyanobacteria, like the one in the fossil, forming all over the Earth. Here's a picture of one. This is a modern one in Australia, in Shark Bay. You can see them if you go on holiday there. They're essentially like corals. So they're little microbes that use sunlight to get energy, but they also manage to accrete themselves together using calcium carbonate. So they make themselves hard, just like a coral reef does. And you can see here in this animation that this is what we envisage the oceans would have looked like on the early Earth. And they were the dominant form of life for billions of years on our planet. Now, the thing is that when plants are as abundant as this, they produce vast amounts of oxygen. And oxygen had a profound effect on life and its evolution on Earth because, again, if we look at this graph, this is time from 4.5 billion years ago to present. And here is oxygen levels in our atmosphere. When life first appeared, there was virtually no oxygen on Earth. Then stromatolites appeared, and gradually, over time, oxygen levels increased radically. As oxygen levels did increase, they allowed a much more complex array of life to develop because oxygen-based physiology and metabolism is just more efficient than oxygen-free or anaerobic metabolism. And you can see evidence of that in rock beds. These orange layers are called red beds. They're essentially oxidized iron in our rocks that show us how much oxygen had built up in the atmosphere of that early Earth. Now, there was also something else that occurred due to all this oxygen. Sex and specialization. Now, sex was a very good thing, not for the reasons you're probably thinking, but because sex allows genetic variety. Sex allows recombination and results in infinite variability. That's why we're all so different. That's why life on Earth is so different. And in addition, specialization. You can allow some cells in your body to form feet, some to form noses, some to form claws and teeth and whatever. And so we ended up with these quite complex multi-celled creatures forming. And they did so largely in a very short period of time known as the Cambrian Explosion. And here again we have time along this axis and the number of species, if you like, up here. And you can see there was an exponential increase in the diversity of life on Earth due to that buildup of oxygen. So think about this for a moment. Everything that lives on our planet today is here because of those fortuitous events, being in the habitable zone, having a star that was just the right age, having just the right combination of gases and liquid water. And what the result is this, that all fungi that are alive today, so mushrooms and fungi in the soil, all derive from this one single-celled fungal ancestor. All of us, all animals on Earth, derive from choanoflagellates, these very simple creatures. And all plants derive from very simple plant-like algae. So in just over 600 million years, these very simple life forms have created the wonders, in effect, that we see on Earth today. Now, this brings us to the notion of evolution, because the diversity of life only exists because of evolution. And evolution is a two-step process. Essentially, first of all, mutation causes changes in people's DNA, in organisms' DNA. And some of those changes are beneficial, and some are disastrous, and some don't have much of an effect at all. If you're lucky enough to get the beneficial ones, you thrive and have more offspring. If you get those traits that are less beneficial, then of course you're less likely to reproduce and pass on those traits. So you need to understand something about evolution. It doesn't give you what you want. It's a process of essentially passive adaptation. So this is a very important notion to have in mind when you consider how life has come to be as diverse as it is today. So look, there's been a whole bunch of transitions. I'm not going to go through, every stage of life that's occurred on the planet Earth. We'd be here all night. But, you consider, for example, the dinosaurs, which were reptiles, and then the age of mammoths and saber-toothed tigers that were mammals. These are massively different stages or transitions in life. But in my view, there's only really been one transition that has really had an importance to life on Earth. And this is the one, I think. You can argue with some scientists that the origin of life was important, but I think really it's humans that have had the grossest impact on our planet. And so really it's this move to so-called civilized society that really has had the greatest and most profound effect on our planet. Of course, some also disagree with that. So, that's really, to my mind, answering the question of where we come from. We essentially come from cosmic dust, and we've evolved due to a confluence of extremely favorable conditions over time. So let's move on to the second question that I wanted to ask, and that was, are we alone? So we understand there's life on Earth, but what about elsewhere? Well, there we have cousins, essentially, in our solar system? Well, Mercury and Venus are simply too hot. There's no liquid water there. The Earth, well, that's our home. We know that there's life there. Mars is pretty close. It's just outside what we know as the habitable zone. And actually, in its very recent past, may have been somewhere that we could have survived. The gas giants, Jupiter and Saturn, these planets are completely inhospitable. Try saying that in front of 100 people. And the outer planets, they're just too cold, minus several hundred degrees. So really our best bet is Mars. And here's a picture of that planet. It's very visible in the sky right now. If any of you are night watchers, you know there's a lunar eclipse tonight, but there was a beautiful Martian view just a week ago that you may have seen, and it's still very visible in our night sky. The case for Mars, well, what amazes me about this planet is that science fiction often informs science when one would imagine that science always informs science fiction. And I find it very interesting the way that fiction and science actually are intertwined quite inextricably. So, for example, Samuel Phelps, not long ago in 1895, wrote this upon the opening of a new telescope in Chicago. It will be possible to see cities on Mars, to detect navies in its harbors, the smoke of great manufacturing cities and towns. Is Mars inhabited? There can be little doubt of it. Conditions are all favorable for life, and life too of a high order. Is it possible to know this for a certainty? Certainly. So this was, near 20th century science. And of course, there's been a whole swathe of science fiction that's considered Mars, and it was pointed out to me by some of my students today that no one's going to get this because they're all old stuff. We don't get any of this, but I see a good demographic in here tonight, so hopefully you recognize some of these. Now, let me make a case for Mars and relate this in a way to my research. I have to do that with a graph. I'm a scientist, after all. On this axis is coldness. So not so cold, very cold, super cold. And up here, dry, super dry, mega dry. This dotted line shows you the point at which water ceases to become a liquid and exists as a vapor. And so New Zealand exists down here. Yeah, we've got plenty of water here. I don't think anyone's going to dispute that. You go to the Arctic and, yeah, there's still water around. It's frozen for some of the time, but there's still plenty of water. However, if you go to Antarctica, there are places in the dry valleys, which is part of New Zealand's protectorate there, where water sublimes. That is, it transitions straight from a solid to a vapor without ever existing as a liquid. And so this is quite Mars-like, because Mars today has an atmosphere that is so thin that water on Mars is either frozen or it's a vapor. It has very little chance to exist as a liquid. However, not so long ago, Mars's atmosphere and its angle of rotation was such that it's quite plausible that water was liquid, and liquid in a quite extensive manner on its surface. So this is why research that I've been doing has focused on Antarctica and on the case for Mars. If you take a look at these two places, here on the left is a picture of Antarctica's dry valleys, a truly beautiful environment. The photos never really do it justice. But on the right, here's a picture of Mars. Now, apart from the tone, the color of this, you could really say that they're remarkably similar. The terrain is similar. And when one gets up close, you see even more similarity. These unusual shapes in the ground here on Mars and here in Antarctica are called frost polygons. They're caused by contraction and expansion of the ground due to changes in the state of water. And actually, the environment on Mars in terms of temperature, water, and even radiation are not too dissimilar to those that we encounter in Antarctica. So the reason that I've been working in that part of this planet is that it's the most similar analog that we have for anything that might exist on Mars. So I guess you'll want to know what lives in those hyper-arid, cold deserts in Antarctica. What have I found that could be possibly a cousin to a Martian? Well, sad to say that the simple answer is not much. There is very little living there, and what does live there is rather cryptic. That is, it's hidden underneath rocks and in the soil, and it's remarkably difficult to find, as some of the guests in the audience know, since we have a good contingent of Antarctic researchers here today. Now, I've done a whole bunch of research, as have others on this, and what we have found is a bunch of really interesting organisms. They're microbes. None of these look like us. They're very simple, single-celled creatures, not dissimilar to those early life forms. And by and large, they are cryptic. That is, they live within rocks. This is a piece of sandstone that I hacked in half, and this green and black color here is life, believe it or not. And what we've been able to do over the years is understand the diversity of life there and what it's actually doing as well. Now, this research has been in collaboration with some incredible organizations. Antarctica New Zealand, which is the logistic support for Antarctic research, and the US Antarctic Program have been extremely generous over the years. And the International Centre for Terrestrial Antarctic Research, which is based here in New Zealand, in Hamilton, at Waikato University. These are really the premier organizations, and I've been very lucky to work with all of them over the years in my research there. Before I move on with the story of life, the universe, and everything, I'll show you a few pictures of Antarctica because it's always something that people are interested in. This is the US part of the story. They provide wonderful airborne logistics support to us. So rather than a 12-week boat journey, we fly down in a little over 5 hours in one of these. So it's really luxury compared to the old days. From Antarctica, New Zealand, they provide the wonderful facilities at Scott Base here on the Ross Island. So this is where we're based for our research and then go out into the field. And we get to go to wonderful places, some of which have never been trodden on by human footprints before. So it truly is an honor to get to work in these environments, never mind the exciting science. And we get to see vistas like this. And really, as I say, the photos don't do it justice. It's truly a remarkable place. And we get to set up scientific experiments and monitor environmental change and discover new life. And so really, we've been extremely fortunate. We do all of this in the dry valleys, and as you can see, there's not much snow and ice, and you haven't seen a penguin yet. So before I move on, I will show you some. But I will also just illustrate the sort of conditions that we're under. So we do science in the field here. We have some extremely important scientific tools, as you can see there. Really critical for our work in every way. But as you can probably guess from the sunburn and the sunscreen and the mess everywhere, it's hard work, okay? It's my annual diet pilgrimage. I like to come back a bit slimmer from those trips. Here's the teams some of the people I've been lucky enough to work with over the years. And we had a few new recruits last year. You might recognize the bloke on the left. Right? Can't tell my left from right. Yes, so the Prime Minister came down, and it was really very exciting for me as a relative newbie to New Zealand to have the Prime Minister in our tent, and more so to have his wife Bronna there. She was a lovely lady and very interested in science too. So finally then, before we leave Antarctica, lots of snow and ice, and there is a penguin there. This is my postdoc Maggie looking at making friends with the local wildlife. So, where were we? Are we alone? Well, could the microbes and creatures I've just shown you that live in Antarctica, could they survive on Mars? Well, hey, they could probably tolerate the cold. They could probably cope with the lack of water in pockets of favorable conditions. And they could undoubtedly tolerate the UV radiation. We've exposed them to similar levels, and they've survived quite happily. The problem is that on Mars, because there is so little atmosphere, there is what we call ionizing radiation. This is the stuff that kills you. And unfortunately, there's not much on Earth that can survive that. So possibly that life that I showed you that lives within rocks, if it was deep enough underground, could survive on Mars. It's quite plausible there could be pockets of life there. But really there is a downside. Mars' atmosphere has been largely stripped away over the years, so the radiation levels are extremely high on the surface. Mars is also no longer volcanically active, so there's no recycling of carbon. So there wouldn't be a possibility for life to develop with the abundance that we see here on Earth. And also, of course, it's damn cold, so most of the water that is there is frozen as ice. So, Mars is really got the jury out at the moment, and especially with regard to NASA's efforts, which are obviously involving vast amounts of money, they're focusing more on detecting signatures of past life rather than expecting to find things that are currently scurrying around on the surface. So how would you do that? How might we detect signatures of life on Mars? Well, I was very lucky to be involved in one of NASA's ASTEP programs, astrobiology science programs that started last year. And this was my first success working at AUT, where we're looking at refining payload for the next generation of landers. And they have a direct objective of searching for what we call biosignatures of life on Mars. So this is work that is being carried out here at AUT, and we're going to be doing the genetic and biochemical testing for that particular project. Now, I've got a video to show you here. It's the next slide. This just shows you an array of what has been sent to Mars before. So this is the little Pathfinder that went up in '97. Now that's the one I remember, being stuck in front of the TV in the classroom and being shown this thing and thinking, oh, big deal. I want to go and play in the playground or something. And actually, it was one of the most profound things that ever happened. Spirit and Opportunity, the most successful rovers, arguably. This is Curiosity, about the size of a mini. Pretty big creatures. This is the new one. Hopefully this animation will work. Excuse the pram wheels, okay, it's not a joke. The payload's worth about $750 million US. The pram wheels are not, but this is being tested in the Atacama Desert and in Antarctica. Essentially, what this device is doing, the engineering's being done at Carnegie Mellon, the biology is being done in Edinburgh, and the microbiology is being done here. And you can see that essentially what we're doing is drilling down into the surface of rocks and soil and trying to extract samples that we can then analyze. So this particular drill was developed with much fanfare because it's able to retract itself whilst retaining integrity of samples. And the movie's probably rather longer than I want to talk about it, but you can see here that it's leaving an impression in the soil, and then as it retracts, it deposits soil into little cups that get analyzed, and you'll see them rotating around any second now. Here, the soil is deposited by a counter-rotation of the drill in these cups, and then it's leveled off and sent to an analyzer. Now, this is a prototype, so it looks a bit Heath Robinson at the moment, I understand, but this is to test the concept, and hopefully this will be more or less what we send up there for the 2020 mission. So that's really the toy that we're having fun with at the moment. And as we leave that, what we really have to do is kind of say, well, look, you can look at Mars, but there's more to it than that. It's not just about our solar system. What about all those other stars up in the sky? Each one of those is a sun, and each one of those has planets revolving around it. So are there other Earths? This is a question that fascinates me, really. And it's fascinated people for centuries. So I found this wonderful quote from a Chinese scholar of the 13th century, Tang Mu. He said, how unreasonable it would be to suppose that besides the heaven and earth, which we can see, there are no other heavens and no other earths. I think that's wonderful. It's a really elegant statement. Similarly, in the 16th century, Giordano Bruno was a monk in Europe, and he had another similarly profound statement to make, that the countless worlds in the universe are no worse and no less inhabited than our Earth. Now, unfortunately, in Europe in the medieval period, it wasn't a particularly tolerant time, and he was burned alive for repeating that out loud. But fortunately, of course, we enjoy much more freedom of thought today. And there's some very interesting things I'd like to share with you from modern theologians. So in 2008, the Vatican published a wonderful article called "The Aliens Are My Brother." And a guy called Father Funes, who was the author, said that he's quite happy to accept the notion of intelligent life out there, and he even speculated some were free from original sin, which is interesting because it probably means they're better behaved than most of us. But that was interesting to me. And his successor actually said that he'd be very happy to baptize an alien. And I mean, I know this is partly made in jest, but it's interesting to see how theology has made a real concrete leap towards understanding the natural world and the world of life, rather than taking the opposite view of rebutting against it. So for me, I'm quite interested in this. Now, of course, we can also extend that concept beyond other Earths. What about galaxies? Is it that, for example, spiral galaxies like our own Milky Way are conducive to support planets with life? because the planets are spread out nicely. They don't bump into each other too much. You know, they're relatively dust rich. You know, is this a galaxy that could support life, and do other galaxies not? You know, for example, ribbon galaxies. And perhaps our Milky Way, our own galaxy, is in just the right spot in the universe to support life. One can extend this wonderful idea of the habitable zone to any level, higher or lower. It's really a wonderful notion. So life beyond our solar system. Something you may have seen in the news over the past few years is the Kepler space telescope, named after a very famous astronomer. But Kepler, and here it is at JPL before it got sent up, Kepler was a wonderful telescope that's able to simultaneously look at the brightness of thousands of stars. And what it does, if you can see the tiny dot here, this is a planet orbiting a star, what Kepler can do is measure the drop in brightness as that planet orbits in front of a star. And it can make calculations about the size, orbit, mass, and even composition of a planet based on its spectrograph. So this is really fascinating science, and literally thousands of planets with an orbit like Earth, with a size like Earth, in the right place in that Goldilocks habitable zone, have been found in our solar system. And so one could say, well, let's apply probability to this. What is the probability really that one of those does not bear some sort of life? Of course, then you get to questions that are even more fantastic. Are there any intelligent aliens out there? And to answer this question, or to address it at least, one has to consider the work of Enrico Fermi, who was, in my view, one of the greatest physicists of the 20th century. And he asked this question. He said, look, if there are extraterrestrials, where are they? He actually rationalized that they can't possibly exist, because he said, look, we haven't been visited by aliens, ergo they don't exist. And this has been discussed ad nauseum and has come to be known as Fermis Paradox. And I'll just explain what that is to you, because to me this is, again, very interesting. He rationalized that if a technological civilization evolves, that within about 1,000 years, it should be able to develop interstellar travel at around about 10% light speed. And then if it took another 1,000 years to travel to the next star, it shouldn't be then too long before they then have the ability to go to the next star and the next and the next. And so within a few million years, he rationalized the whole galaxy should be explored. So his argument was, look, where are they? They should be here. If aliens exist who are intelligent, then we should actually have seen them by now. And of course, if you look at our efforts to make ourselves known, they've really been rather trivial. You've probably all seen Contact with Jodie Foster, which focused on SETI, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. It's a bunch of people who are looking at radio waves. It's a fantastic idea, but of course the simple truth is that we've only been sending radio waves out for 60 years or so, and they haven't traveled that far away, and it takes an awful long time for radio waves from other planets to come back to us. So it's not really a sort of a broad spectrum analysis. And the only man-made object which has left our solar system is Voyager, and it's really only just at the edge right now. So we're really not doing too well in terms of making ourselves known. So if there are intelligent aliens, they need to come to us. But of course, that could go either way. So probably we need to be a bit careful about that. They might not be as friendly as we would like to think. So I'm now going to try and address that third and final question. Where are we going? We've looked at where life came from, and we've looked at a few threads of argument, whether or not we're alone. Where are we going? Well, as the sun gets older, it's going to get hotter. And in about 1 billion years or so, it simply won't be able to support life on Earth. Now, you might say 1 billion years is a long time, but do we really want to admit that life's going to die out? For me, it's there's a philosophical argument here. Of course, it could happen a lot sooner. Now, this may look like something from a Hollywood movie, but giant asteroid impacts have happened in the past. Here's the Chicxulub crater in Mexico. This is what's widely believed to have wiped out the dinosaurs some 65 million years ago. The frequency of occurrence for large impacts is about 1 every 100 million years. So in about the next 35 million years, we're due a big one. So we ought to hurry up and develop some sort of Star Trek-like ability. And of course, mass extinctions have occurred with remarkable frequency in Earth's history. Here is time, again, from way before present all the way up to now. And these spikes here just show you the percentage of all life on Earth that's been wiped out by extinction events. So it's not unusual for life to be knocked out of Earth. Could the next one include humans? We don't know. The timescales, I know, seem implausibly long, but just consider this, that in 1 billion years, we've come from a planet that supported only little bacteria living in the ocean creating oxygen to what you see around you today. And do we really want to admit that humanity has a finite lifespan? I certainly don't. It's a philosophical argument. Plus, of course, we've probably got way less time than you think. This is a graph that you may have seen before, but it's very, very important in my view. This is time here, but instead of time in billions of years, this is the 60s, and this is the present. And here, this is the global usage. The red line shows you the footprint that humanity is having on the Earth. That is the amount of consumption of resources that we are doing. And this green line shows you the ability of the Earth to sustain that level of usage. So in the 1970s, we crossed a point where the number of human beings on the planet was unsustainable. As you can see, the gap is getting rather bigger. So depressingly, there is cause for concern. And if you followed the IPCC announcements in the last few weeks, you'll see that really the time for change has come. Otherwise, we may be in dire trouble. So this was really a nod to my son, who's very fond of this cartoon. So I put it up here. But it's very plausible that these could be Earth's last residents. So if that happens, and assuming we're all still around in 1 billion years, we've got to go somewhere else. Where do we go? Well, we could go and live in space stations, but the physiological challenges of living in space and the resourcing challenges are just so huge as to be unthinkable in many cases. It's not a long-term solution. And another option is terraforming. That is the notion that what we could do is perhaps change another planet to be more Earth-like. And in particular, a lot of effort has been spent in looking at Mars and whether or not that planet could be made more Earth-like. As the habitable zone creeps outwards towards Mars, could we perhaps make it somewhere we could live? The reason for that is that one can liken the process on Mars of changing or terraforming it almost to a trip from the top of a mountain down to sea level. So Mars today is a pretty hostile place. So the atmosphere there is about the same as if you were 40 k's up in our own atmosphere. So really not the sort of place you want to live today. However, it's been reasoned that after about 300 years of cyanobacterial colonization, it's possible that Mars' environment would not be dissimilar to that of high altitudes on Earth today. And after a further 300 years, one could introduce plants that were more efficient at creating oxygen, and that you could find an environment on Mars that was alpine-like. And after a further period of time, we would get montane ecosystems, and then eventually, within 1,000 years, it's been very optimistically, I give you, very optimistically estimated that we could create an environment that was habitable at least for primitive life, if not for ourselves. So is this our next home? I don't know. It's, there are way too many ifs at the moment, but I like to be optimistic that the power of inquiry in the human mind is such that I'm sure that as these problems arise, we will address them successfully. So I think I'll summarize by re-asking those 3 questions. Where do we come from? Well, the very simple answer is that we come from stardust. But of course, importantly, it doesn't explain our purpose. Are we alone? Well, in my view, probably not. But we're really not sure how smart those aliens might be. They could be little bacteria, or they could be, smart and benign or hostile, who knows? And finally, where are we going? Well, we have to leave Earth one day. Everyone knows that. And Mars is probably the most realistic option. So that concludes my little sort of personal viewpoint on life. Thank you very much.